So we can jump into some of the general questions, and I'll open this up to anyone who would like to answer. And we'll start off with the question, when we have to pay for education, who is being left out, and how do tuition fees impact access to education for marginalized communities?
I can start. I mean, user fees always have have the effect of reproducing systemic inequities, socioeconomic inequities. They just simply do. I mean, often the argument is made that, well, the feds or the province are providing some form of assistance. Although I think it's really interesting how they lump grants and loans together as if the equivalent of a credit card debt is the same thing as like something, an inheritance, for example. It's not. And of course, debt has incredibly gendered and racialized implications as well. So we see that debt lingers longer. The effects of debt linger longer for women, particularly racialized women, racialized communities, right? We also know that the impact of debt is profound and lasts well after the debt is actually paid off. So you may have a 10-year repayment program, but that's also 10 years of delayed major life decisions, right? I mean, there's other obviously market measures, right? You're less likely to have as much in savings. You're less likely to be able to buy a house. If you don't own a house, you're more likely to have a mortgage. I mean, all these things as well. But the fact of the matter is, we know that societies that have access to post-secondary education, to education fully, there's more civic engagement. People tend to be healthier. Parents tend to read to their kids more. I mean, they tend to vote more, right? I mean, these are all these benefits that can be quantified, but don't need to be. I mean, I want to live in a civically engaged community, but what we don't necessarily consider are how the impacts of debt, the long-term impacts of debt, counteract and in some cases actually eliminate that. We know that there are many more instances of anxiety, mental health concerns. Debt is hard to live with, and it's hard to live with as you're accumulating it as a student. It's hard to live with as you're preparing to go on to post-secondary education, desperate to save so that you actually accumulate as little debt as possible, knowing that you're still going to accumulate debt throughout the process. So we are creating conditions, a sort of a false promise of access to post-secondary education and all the benefits that that's supposed to produce for society. And it does, but we're also doing it at the cost of this other half of the equation, which is everything that actually contradicts, counteracts all those benefits, which again, reproduces all those socioeconomic inequalities that fully funded public education at its absolute best is actually really well positioned to help us overcome. So that is the deep irony and the horrible betrayal, really.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely. I think you hit all the points there. And the idea of false promises, I think, is definitely very prominent, and a way that, the sneaky tactics are used so that folks don't understand the implications all the time, or aren't aware of the ways that they're being taken advantage of by society, and by the ways that the government is expecting them to pick up the tab so that they don't have to prioritize post-secondary education and all the factors that go with it. Do other folks have anything that they want to add to this?
Yeah, I just want to say that at York University, I was really struck when I started teaching, like I'm in a PhD program, so I was a teaching assistant. And when I first started teaching, I was really struck by like how many low-income students we have coming from like neighboring suburbs, right? And there are definitely like I guess a smaller amount of wealthier students, and that kind of creates class divides within the student movement, right? Which we have to figure out how to overcome. But there's quite, like I'd say the vast majority of York students are working, right? They're working like fast food restaurants, jobs on campus. I knew like people who are, doing security on campus or working other places, right? And even when we had our fast food service workers strike, there were some students who were workers and also studying at the same time. So, yeah, it's really rough for students. My own students, I think they have a hard time concentrating. I see a lot of people drop out, or they're just like, tired in our tutorials and in our classes, right? So, that means that students like just aren't doing as well, you know, that there's so many demands on them. And especially, I'm sure that stress of accumulating the debt, right, while they're studying, that, you know, it's really hard. Like, I think a lot of students, I mean, I luckily teach labor rights, so I'm trying to, you know, empower people and say, like, you know, push back, like push for a higher minimum wage. Like, we had a lot of students, some of my own students joined the campaign, the Fight for 15 and Fairness, right? So I am trying to make them, you know, realize, like, it's not your fault that you're in this position. This is systemic, right? Like, yeah, we should talk more about how tuition fees have gone up, funding for universities has gone down. I even try to, you know, really educate them on how things like the corporate tax rate has gone down so much in Canada, right? And that could be a potential source of, you know, getting revenue to then put toward our public universities and colleges, right? But my students didn't know that history, right? So yeah, there's a lot of educating to do. And, you know, some of the students, again, who would join our cross-campus alliance, and those who work would just do what they can, right? If they have a moment to maybe do some petitioning, but, you know, they're also, of course, working and studying, you know, then those who had the time in our cross-campus alliance would support those students, you know, on the picket lines, like, you know, asking for an increase for, you know, those who work at Aramark, right? So yeah, it's really tough. But again, I think there are ways to push back, and cross-campus alliances are key, at least for universities and colleges, right?
Yeah, and I love what you said, and I think that it's something that isn't always thought about, or isn't always kind of like put to your head, is that you know, it's not students or workers. Oftentimes, students are workers too.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and I think that that's such an important thing for folks to remember, and definitely like a foundation too for building those coalitions and having individuals want to be involved and feel part of the collective action.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Ian, yeah, go ahead.
I think this is a related point, but the greater the cost of tuition, sometimes the greater the sacrifice of the people, of the student and the payee and of the payor, and they're more aware of the return on that cost, the return on that investment. And if people pay a lot for a course, they want to make sure many students feel they want to make sure they get a benefit from that. So they start choosing courses that they think will pay off at the window in some way or other. And they choose differently when it's more expensive, because they have to make sure that first they've got to pay the debt back, and also that there's going to be some type of positive gain. And they don't sometimes choose courses that are based on general interest, but rather courses that will help them get employment or in some sense of career advancement. And also the behavior in the courses is now geared towards doing what it will take to make that course pay off, and not necessarily spending time on those assignments, those aspects of the course that they don't regard as generating some benefit to them at the end. So it changes. The more expensive it is, it changes the whole attitude of people towards the course and their behavior in the course. And I think I don't know if this is distinct from marginalized communities, but I think to some extent it's maybe more marked in some communities, because people are trying to to use their education to advance their particular circumstance, and so it affects their decisions. And from a faculty perspective, it's sometimes quite dispiriting, because people appear to be there for particular reasons, and they aren't always consistent with the objectives of the course. And the more expensive it is, I think the more you're likely to encounter that type of circumstance or situation.
If I could add just to that point, Ian, it's actually interesting. I mean, I think what we're seeing more and more, I mean, anecdotally, I've heard this, and I think that it's interesting to consider whether or not the focus on when the customer is always right, or depending how much you actually end up paying for, you know, paying in tuition fees, in some instances, particularly for international students, but not exclusively, paying the entire cost of the education as if there were no public funding at all. What are you paying for? Are you paying for the education, or are you paying for the grade at the end, right? So I think that it's an interesting way of confusing, particularly when the job, when the allure of a job, or what an employer might say about a student who graduates from a particular program, or if you've been in that program in order to, move into that particular area of the workforce, what takes precedent? What you learn along the way, or the grade you get when you graduate? What are you paying for?
Awesome. Thank you, folks. We have a question from our viewers, and the question is, why are universities relying on sessional faculty instead of investing in tenured or track faculty? How can we put an end to this? And what role can sessional faculty unions play in ensuring an end to the sessional trap? But lastly, is it contradictory for sessional faculty unions to fight for the ultimate elimination of sessional positions? So that is a bit of a loaded one, but yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Can I start? So what was the last part of that question?
So the last part is it contradictory for sessional faculty unions to fight for the ultimate elimination of sessional positions?
Okay, I'll give you, most of my comments are Ryerson based, I guess, but I think the payroll, our Ryerson payroll before benefits is for faculty, for tenure stream faculty, is about 160 million, I think, or maybe it's gone up a little more than that. And our payroll for our sessional faculty is between 30 and 40 million, I think. And the sessional faculty teach 60% of the courses. Not necessarily the students, because their classes are a bit smaller, but of the courses, well, actually until the budget, the tuition cuts last year, where classes for full-time faculty went even higher, and there was something of a cut of sessional appointments. But we had the sessional faculty payroll is a fifth of the of the tenure stream payroll, and they teach 50% more. So that's why universities would prefer to use sessional faculty. Now it's true, regular faculty and tenure stream faculty do they do research and they perform services and such like that the sessional faculty often don't do. So there are others, but the university's yield isn't generated by those. Much university's yield is generated by tuition, and that comes from teaching. And if they can create a workforce of just basically part-time, precarious teachers that teach on demand at a much lower rate of pay, that's where that's how they maximize the yield. So that's the answer, I think, almost always why sessional faculty are used. And it doesn't speak well to an academic institution. And the other thing, though, is you do need some flexibility. I mean, if you've got a permanent workforce, there are going to be times when you need a utility person to come in and teach a course on a short-term basis, because they're going to be sort of gaps to fill. So there's a legitimate case to use part-time faculty, but just nowhere near on the scale that they've been used. And in fact, our collective agreement allows for them on this sort of in this sort of properly benign way, and it's just grown out of proportion, and they've been used in a way that was never, this is sessional faculty, that was never intended. Okay, can I go on to the second part? Ideally, the more full-time faculty positions there are, essentially, the more opportunities there would be for sessional faculty members. And so by creating, or by lobbying for more full-time, you may be creating a more secure, sustainable position for yourself. But the experience is that these people, they sort of grow, what's the phrase, sort of lean on the vine. If you teach sessional for many, many years, familiarity sometimes breeds contempt. You aren't actually having the opportunity to do the same research. So your salability for these positions declines as your career advances as a sessional. So it's a hard road to hoe for them to move across. And I think the experience often is when positions are created, the current sessional faculty have an uphill battle getting those positions. Some do, maybe a lot do, but there isn't a direct conversion rate. And so I think it is in everybody's interest to reduce the sessional ranks and to increase the tenure stream ranks. But I think the current sessional complement of probably would pay something of a price.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I think you covered a lot of the points there. And really it's about the fact that, the precarity of work has been taken advantage of greatly for financial gain. And it's challenging because so many people are reliant on jobs right now and having access to those incomes that that's what the universities and institutions count on in order to be able to secure this cheap labor, and instead of funneling it into faculty positions or tenure positions, which, as you said, are much more costly for these organizations to be able to employ. So I think that's where the campus alliances come in, coalition alliances come in too, and trying to flesh out those asks and what could possibly be done on campuses to unite in these initiatives. And, whether that's creating or demanding pathways in which, maybe there's a certain number of years that somebody would work as a contract faculty before advancing into tenure, but having some clear-cut timeline, because right now it's endless and there is no set date, the ways in which they operate, but definitely tricky. And that was a really great question. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to add on to that?
Go ahead, Alia, please.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say that, the rise of this precarious, part-time, casual, like temporary labor is, not only happening in teaching, but like in libraries and, of course, food services and all the different ranges of, services on campus, but staff as well. So the York University Staff Association has brought that to our attention. So it's in so many aspects of universities and colleges, like it's kind of scary, right? I mean, if you are in a union, then you can try to, push back through your collective agreements. And certainly like what Ian said, in terms of pushing for more conversions of sessional instructors to, tenured, more permanent positions at the university is something that we're pushing for. And I think through our alliance, gain the support of both, all the different unions that are representing these workers, like in this case, like the Faculty Association, and then QP 303. So in that case, they are, they have a common goal and are pushing for the same thing, right?
A few years ago, we put out a report that looked at the growth of precarity across the university and college sector in Ontario. And absolutely agree, Alia. It's not, yes, obviously it's throughout faculty as well, but it's an administration. And there's also just been a fair bit of growth in sort of middle management in the university sector as well, and college sector, which I think is quite interesting. And we don't tend to talk about it all that much. Presidents' salaries are, for the most part, capped. They're significant, but they're capped. But there is this sort of middle stretch where you actually have seen a fair bit of growth. Precarity is inherently gendered. It is really interesting what areas of campus are determined to be more, I guess, precarity friendly, I suppose, or apt to be determined, or the workforce in those areas is more likely to be precarious. The other thing about faculty and precarity, of course, is in addition to paying them much less, they have very little job protection. So I think there's a direct link there between academic freedom on campus and the ability of sessionals to feel as though they can speak freely about various topics. It's also, I find it quite fascinating when you have universities and colleges talking about, why students should go there, like selling their wares, right, to this new generation of people who will pay tuition fees, this new generation of consumers. But this huge swelling, it's been part of the university and college framework and sort of structural workforce framework for about 10 years now, but it is 50% and growing in other areas, right? It's actually slightly above 50% in Ontario. It somehow goes undiscussed. And we are talking about people who have to work tremendously hard to meet the needs of the students whose needs they just want to meet, right? Just educational needs they just want to meet. So when you hear from professionals who are talking about having to have office hours in stairwells or literally on the phone in their car driving from one campus to another, that has a tremendous impact on the supports that these faculty who work very hard can provide to students. So it actually has an impact on students too. So I think, looking at it comprehensively and building those alliances that Alia was talking about is so important, because I think there is overlap. We probably just don't recognize the extent to which it is there. And of course, that's another offshoot of the sort of more individualized approach to post-secondary education or education in general. It keeps us all very isolated, thinking about what tax credit you might be eligible for, or what grant or loan you might get, or how much of a payoff you're getting from the education you paid a lot of money for. So I think, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion tonight, but also appreciate what the other panelists have said about the need to really work together and have those discussions and organize across various aspects of a campus, but also across generations, because there's a fairly significant generational gap too in understandings of what was considered normal once and what is normal now. And the normal now is not the normal we need to be returning to post-COVID.
Go ahead, Ian.
Make another point. I'm just picking up on the administrative bloat and the middle ranks of it's a high earners. The fact is there are more students at universities now than ever before. Not necessarily that many more faculty members, but these students have to be processed. I mean, a lot of this, Ryerson's tripled in size. It needs a lot more people to admit the students and to process them through their stay at Ryerson and to manage their respective files. So you need more managers and more administrators and such like, and it becomes much, as I said, it's something of a student mill. Not necessarily that much more faculty, because you can basically increase the yield by larger and larger classes and such like. But there is you can see why there's more administration. It's because there's so many people on the campus that need to be serviced, and that then leads to a sort of a public relations dimension as well. University has to promote itself in order to attract and maintain those volumes of students, and has to sell itself. And so you have people at the university now responsible for crafting all sorts of campaigns and mark university and selling it up and down and so on. And I mean, university advertising has taken on a whole new art form in the last 20 years, something that you would never have associated with universities of the past. And so that's why there are just more people. It's a transformed type of institution now. I don't speak only of Ryerson, I think it's true of many of them. And that's why there's so many people. And it's a very corporate model now. And the teaching and research that takes place at the lower core is sometimes just a vehicle for people to advance their careers in these organizations on a sort of corporate institutional level. And that's where the bloat is coming from. And money is coming in and going out, and it's going nowhere near the students.
Thank you, folks. Are we okay to do one more question? Is that okay? Yeah? Awesome. Yeah, because this conversation is so amazing. And we're going to finish off with a question that is a combination of one from our viewers, as well as just kind of a nice wrap up altogether. And our viewer asked, how can we lobby the provincial and federal governments for more funding to post-secondary institutions? And in addition to that, what could the future of education look like if it was 100% publicly funded?
Can I start with part two?
Whatever works for you.
Well, there's a whole bunch of ways that can look different, right? It's going to be more affordable, because we talked about how the effects of student debt linger. Fewer savings, postponement of major life decisions, healthier. Financial anxiety has a tremendous implications for mental health, and it impacts students, in the lead up to post-secondary education, while you're at post-secondary education, watching that debt rack up higher and higher. And then as your payments are due, and then the effects of debt live with you, they're life-changing. It would look more sustainable and more resilient. If we had a policy of zero tuition, right? If universities and colleges were truly publicly funded, when you have a major economic meltdown, when an entire sector of the workforce changes, when something catastrophic happens, if you have fully funded public education, workers can dip in and out of that system. They can acquire new skills, they can acquire new knowledge, and they can do it in the context of a rapidly changing job market rather than taking on more debt, right? It's a much more resilient approach. I mean, we have federal programs and provincial training programs, not enough, but that are there to design to quickly train people so that they can move into another job. And of course, some of these are sort of very corporate driven as well. And this is not to negate the need for on-the-job training, but we can actually incorporate this into a fully funded public model of education and training, which actually makes for a much more resilient workforce as well. More equitable. We know that debt holders are overwhelmingly women. Job market inequality ensures that women and racialized workers with student debt will be more impacted. And frankly, it's more innovative. Like, it is really, like, we keep talking about the need for a more innovative society, you know, people being all entrepreneurial. It is really, really hard to be innovative and entrepreneurial when you graduate and you're saddled with $60,000 worth of debt. You know, innovators are largely people who have inherited a lot of money, or whose parents can actually foot the bill for them to, you know, experiment a little bit. So if we actually want to pursue a more innovative, more resilient, more equitable, more sustainable, less stressed, healthier, more affordable society, we could actually start talking about really investing in post-secondary education and training. And that, I think, is how it would fundamentally change the world we live in now.
Awesome. Thank you, Erika. Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
No, I agree with everything Erika said, but I think in addition to that, if it was 100% publicly funded, maybe the customer service model wouldn't dominate in the way that it does, and there'd be much more integrity in the system, and how people, the students, the faculty relate to the subject matter and to each other would be very different, and decisions can be made with integrity and such like, and that would be a very, very positive change.
I'll jump in here if that's okay. You know, one thing I think that we could do as a student movement is talk more about how free education, publicly funded education has been achieved in other countries, right? You know, I immediately think of Cuba. Just because, you know, I love that they have free education, like at all levels, that they have great public services. You know, I've spent some time there, and it actually, what you're talking about, Ian, in terms of like student interest, I think, you know, students there are able to genuinely learn, you know, what they want to, and especially in social sciences, right? Even though they may do something, you know, different later in their lives, like in terms of work. But I think people have like a genuine, you know, yearning, like, to learn and to do what they want, at least when they go to college and university. And so, yeah, it's a shame to see here, especially in Toronto, students are in programs that they're not interested in, like York, you know, our business school, our law school, all the entrepreneurial programs, and, you know, things that the university is like pushing on people. Some are genuinely interested, and there's a lot of students who are not, right? But they think that I have to do this because it's going to lead to better employment. And then it's also crushing when, say, you go into an engineering program and then you struggle to find work, because even that field, you know, in many cases is becoming precarious, right? So I do think we need to look to other models and say, like, this is actually achievable in other countries, right? And, you know, Cuba is not as wealthy as Canada, and they're facing, you know, blockade by the United States and all sorts of other issues, but, you know, they can do it, right? And they have amazing, you know, health system. They're dealing with COVID, I think much better than we are. You know, I can go on about that, but, you know, I do think we need to talk about other models, and then also directly to the question, incorporate that when we lobby to governments. I think, you know, in my experience lobbying as a student, I think we're talking, of course, of the benefits of lowering tuition, having free education, but I don't think, and we're pointing enough to alternative models. I just find that often in the student movement and in the labor movement as well, we're just asking, like, we need more funding. We're, you know, just desperate. We need to, you know, have better funding of public services. They're cut to the bone. And this really reminds me of childcare right now. Like, in Ontario, you know what I mean? Like, all these childcare centers might close. And so, of course, it's really important for us to defend those services, to have high quality public services. But I also think, like, it might not be enough to just say we need funding. We also need to talk about where that funding is coming from. And that's where we can look to, you know, alternative economic models. And in my opinion, again, I think a quick fix would be like looking at corporate tax rates and looking at a new wealth tax or something, even just restoring corporate tax rates in Canada would make a huge difference. It'd be a huge source of revenue that we could then put into public services, right? So I think we do, in a sense, need to change the way that we lobby. Instead of just asking for more funding for universities and colleges, say like how it can be done, right?
I think the other, fully agree. And I think that the other point is that, the federal government and provincial governments spend a not insignificant amount of public money making education less public. So, I mean, we're looking at, grants. We are looking at, the CESG, the federal government portion of the RESPs. We are looking at, prepared to pay close to $1 billion to have a charity administer a pseudo volunteer program that would pay students a maximum of $10 an hour, for example. We're looking at the CESB. I mean, there is not an insignificant amount of money that tax credits, right, which benefit the wealthier families. So I mean, there's not an insignificant amount of money that actually could be reinvested in the system and make it less private. The problem, of course, is I think the federal government seems to have a vested interest in sort of doing it on these, directing money to individuals and to families rather than to the system, because to redirect it to the system actually implies that there is something called the commons and we all own it, right? I mean, when we're talking about making like lowering tuition fees or even calling for zero tuition, we're not saying no one wants to pay for their education. We're just wanting to change the payment plan and the method of payment, right? So to one that actually corresponds with, the system of progressive taxation where people actually do pay what they can afford, right? So it's much more efficient, it's much more logical, it's much more economical, it's much more equitable. And we have pieces in place that we actually just sort of have to remind ourselves and remind the federal and provincial governments that they're actually fairly effective, and that there's a lot of money that goes into making them seem less and less effective. So I fully agree with you, Alia. I think, thinking about, where that money is going to come from. And there are other models we can learn from. You mentioned Cuba. Germany is another really interesting one. And then also you can look at what happened in the UK where they said, no, just a little bit of tuition, just for a little while. And of course, tuition has skyrocketed since. So, I mean, and then also looking at money that is actually being put into the system, that is going into subsidizing the system in order to make it less public. So I think we do have to get smart and we have to get strategic and again, continue to talk to each other about how we can do this and push both governments, both levels of government, to remind them that the public is actually fully aware that what COVID has shown us is the abject failure of a system that depends on user fees, right? You've got universities in the States that are literally going to have to close their doors because people can't afford to pay tuition fees. I mean, if there was sort of a robust system of public investment, we would not be having this conversation. We would be talking about how to pivot and actually support students and faculty and the university and universities and colleges as places of work and places of learning and places of living, because people live there too.
Definitely, yeah. I think, go ahead, Ian.
Just related to that, I think it's the opposite of free education, is the notion that professional programs actually charge more because you're going to get more out of it at the end. It's completely buying into exactly what we're saying shouldn't happen. That, law programs, medical programs, such like charge more. They charge greater tuition because the argument is people will earn more when they come out. So it's very much a cost benefit. And I think it was the Center for Policy Alternatives. There was some paper some time ago that made the comment that if they do pay more, if they do earn more, then they will pay more in taxes anyway. And there's no reason why you should charge or restrict it to the rich at the early days because they're going to earn more. It should be more. That's a reason for making it more accessible, not less. But the fact is that the professional programs charge more is very much a cost-benefit approach to education. It sends the opposite message to the one that we're talking about. And then I think but something else has happened in the States in the last few months, where they're now charging. I think they're going to charge more for the humanities and such like because they don't have any benefit to society. And that's when the whole thing is reversed on itself. So I don't know if that's really worth pursuing in this discussion. What I started off by saying was that by charging people tuition that's based on their income they're going to earn really undercuts the sort of ideological value of education.
Yeah, I think you folks, again, hit basically all the points. One thing that I'll add, kind of building off of Erika's point, is that when talking about, the money that's been spent during COVID-19 in financial relief, rather than having a system that already works, when the Canadian Federation of Students talks about universal education, through research, we found that, it would cost approximately $10 billion a year for universal education. And through the CESB and various initiatives that the government has pursued, they've already spent about $9 billion. So it shows that the money is there. It's just budgets are about priorities, and it's about investing in the future of post-secondary education. On that note too, is that it's really important that we're talking about education for all. So that includes international students too, who right now pay exorbitant tuition fees, the highest everywhere. And it's important that when we are looking at the ways that education functions, these individuals contribute so heavily to research, so heavily to our classroom environments, and they do contribute back to the economy as well. So they are well deserving of the same benefits that domestic students should receive too. So thank you so much, Erika, Alia, and Ian, for this discussion, your contributions. So just a little shout out to each of our panelists. Please do follow them on social media. So Alia's work can be contributed back to the the Graduate Students Union at York that she spoke about. So this is at YUGSA84 on Twitter. Erika can be followed at Erika Shaker on Twitter, and you can contact Ian at ian.sakinofsky at ryerson.ca. And if folks who are on the video could just type those out into the chat box, I think that'd be super helpful for folks to be able to see that. And then you can also get involved with CFS, the Canadian Federation of Students, by following us on social media at CFS FCEE. And just a note too, going back to that other question about, how can we lobby our governments? One thing is that through Uniting Through Campus coalitions, this is a really great way to pressure our administration to actually go back to the government saying that they're not happy with how the funding is. Right now, they're very compliant in the ways in which the strategic mandate agreements are voiced, and that's the ways that they receive their financial public funding for the institutions. We really need to make sure that when lobbying against the government, we are fully united in that front. It'll be a much stronger fight ultimately. It's going to take some work. It's going to take a lot of pressure and a lot of time, but these are things that we need to be investing our efforts into. As well as through the Canadian Federation of Students, we are in the process of putting out a new campaign called Education for All. We're super excited on this. It'll be out hopefully in the next couple of months. So please do stay tuned to our social media, and we'll have great ways to get involved through that as well. So thank you again to the collaborators of CESAR, the Ryerson Graduate Students Association, the Ryerson Faculty Association, the Jack Layton Chair of Ryerson University, and CFS. Thank you again for having us. And join the next panel discussion that CESAR and these collaborators will be hosting for the post-secondary education series. This will be taking place on Thursday, August 6th at 7 p.m. here again on Facebook Live. And the next topics will focus on the important discussion of students and workers uniting against precarious work in precarious times. So a very nice continuation of most of the topics that folks have been touching on today. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.